Hello and welcome to LogRocket. I'm Kalen, engineer at LogRocket, and joining me today is Kirupa Chinnathambi, the product manager at Google, works on Firebase. Recently, you might have seen Firebase feature prominently in the Google I/O keynote. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you, Kaylin.
So, I'm sure many developers, especially developers familiar with Google products, are familiar with Firebase. Probably for over 10 years now. I know my first introduction to Firebase was using on a hackathon project forever ago. Um, so it's good to see that it's still getting in a lot of updates. Do you want to give like a quick rundown, like what's new in Firebase?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give some background for everybody who may not have had the luxury of using Firebase many years ago or even at a hackathon kind of a project, Firebase is really about simplifying app development with a real focus on building a web app or a mobile app like iOS or Android, and really all the various stages that go into building an app. How do I think about an idea? How do I start writing the code? How do I debug it? And once I have my application built, how do I get it out the door into various customers' hands? And how do I make sure that once it is out the door, that we have really good ways of measuring how are people using it? How is the performance? Are people, is it crashing? How do we make sure that the whole end-to-end life cycle for a product is properly maintained through developer tooling and backend services and the whole set of things that go on there? And the real goal behind Firebase is simplification. You have your hands full building your client-side applications and having to balance both that and all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes with like your databases, your authentication, and your monitoring for performance and crashes can be overwhelming. And so Firebase is really about, how do we give you an integrated set of tools and services that simplify that world for you so you can spend more time really just fiddling with the things that you care about more, which is really great user experience and client-side apps and so on. And so to answer your question on what's new in Firebase, it's really just continuing down that journey of as technologies evolve, how do we take advantage of the latest things that people are building on? But how do we continue to simplify and make our products just better for all these audiences so that we continue to show that it is easy to build great apps without having to sacrifice power and flexibility and capabilities, which oftentimes comes with the idea of simplification.
Yeah, worthy goal. Especially, it seems to be a common theme. I guess it's on everyone's mind recently, like with the proliferation of like Next.js and all these like fully packaged frameworks. It's everyone's seems to be racing to make things as easy as possible, which is, I think, a welcome change from maybe in the past.
Yeah.
You have quite a long career. Worked at Microsoft, Salesforce, and now Google. And I do remember your website, Kirupa.com, back when it was like Flash tutorials, I think.
Correct.
Yeah.
I always was interested in Flash for a long
Yes.
time, and it was just back in the day where there was no like online communities or forums or things where you can share what
Right.
you're building on. And so I kind of accidentally stumbled upon it, and that kind of got me into essentially the long journey to where I am right now, which is working, continue to work in technology, working with developers, working on how to simplify the world for developers. And right now I am at Google.
Yeah. That's quite a journey. I see it's still focused on tutorials and such. Is that something that you like do in your free time or like?
It really is. Before it was a case where it's still a hobby and it's still something I maintain for several reasons now. In many cases, if you take a step back and look at what do I do as my day job, which is oftentimes just taking abstract ideas, simplifying it, and communicating it back out. And so the hobby that that I started many years ago allows me to kind of reinforce those skills a bit. I just happen to take complicated technical topics. My audience really is not technical individuals or visual thinkers in many ways who look at things more from from like a pixels point of view as opposed to a just logical lines of code point of view. And so that gives me a lot of practice, both between my work, giving me the energy to keep doing this outside of it, and then the hobby, which reinforces my work. So I almost like create a cycle where I get to just focus on what I really enjoy doing, which is kind of just taking complex problems and breaking it down.
Yeah, it's almost like a secret weapon as a PM, where you to get a pulse on the community. Um,
Exactly, exactly. And I also get really fidgety if I don't write code for a period of time. So this gives me that outlet where, as part of my day job, I don't really write a whole lot of production code,
right.
or actually any production code. But as a hobby, maintaining that still keeps me both, keeps me like focused on like some technical problems. It also keeps me in touch with developers as well. I think one of the biggest things I really enjoy about this is that I get both proactively and indirectly I get just inundated with feedback from various people who are like building things and going, "This is difficult. How do you simplify it?" Or vice versa, where I reach out occasionally and go like, "We're trying to do say, A, B, and C. What are your thoughts here?" And so it's been really great having that two-way conversation and being a part of a community that is really tuned to, in this case, like development. Makes that much easier for me.
Yeah. Back on that subject of making things easier, you want to talk a little bit about Firebase extensions? Because I wasn't even aware that Firebase had extensions, but it seems very fully featured now.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're building an app, there's just so many things that go on, behind the scenes. At the very basic level, if you look think about a long time ago, you had dedicated servers. You had some code running on a server because you couldn't have certain things running locally on your device. You had to either do some authentication or have some data that was scaling across millions of users. It was very tricky. And so, at a fundamental level, one of the things that Firebase really started off with was a real-time database, being able to have data that goes into a data store, and then that automatically updates it for any client that is currently using it. And that extended over a period of time to a variety of backend services, including, for example, authentication or Cloud Functions, which is our serverless compute product. And then as people were using it, as we decided to see where can we continue to move the needle on simplification, what we realized is that what a lot of our developers are looking for are integrations. Let's say, for example, I need to process payments. It's very easy for me to go and not easy, but with enough effort, enough using Google and Stack Overflow, you can kind of wire together five different services, write enough code, and then have some of these things working. But instead of having the developer do all this work, what if we made it possible for to actually say that you're integrating payments from these top providers? What if we gave you a prepackaged solution that still uses all these various internal primitives behind the scenes, but instead of you having to worry about configuring all those services up, orchestrating between all these various backends, what if we just handle that for you? And extensions really came out of that goal of how do we simplify this whole complicated backend space by focusing more on solutions and end results as opposed to the individual Lego blocks that might go into figuring out how all these things work.
It certainly lowers the barrier of entry. And yeah, at LogRocket, I know how much everyone likes integrations. It's one of our most requested and time consuming to develop features.
Exactly. Who would have ever guessed that developers don't like to rehash the wheel, every single time they want to do something that is pretty commonplace.
Yeah, especially with real time features and such. Like part of the reason why everyone seems to use it in hackathons is no one wanted to go through all that trouble, and you just want it to just work
Yeah,
like nothing.
exactly. You have bigger problems to deal with right now than figuring out like how my input and output might work over a network connection.
Yeah, there's also a time I remember, like 10 or so years ago, where Firebase was almost like it was the de facto solution, and there wasn't much anything else out there. But over time now, I've seen lots of Firebase alternatives and such. So, would you say that maybe the increased competition in the open source community and such is kind of what led Firebase to focus more on extensions and like productivity and such?
I think the competition plays a role, but I think the biggest role really is just us talking to customers and identifying where some of the opportunities are. Because as with any technology, you've been doing this for a very long time as well. You kind of see that something is new and cool, then it gets democratized, and everybody starts building on something like that. And so it's often up to us to kind of see what is the next best thing to keep improving upon. Because once developers realize that okay, this pain point is now solved, it doesn't mean there's no more pain points available. What used to be like number two or number three on their list of things that were making development hard now becomes their new number one. So it's a constant cycle of like, how do we keep making the development experience easier? And it's also all relative. And if you compare the pain points developers have today in building apps, it's very different than what it was like 5 years ago. And I'm sure 5 years from now, it'll be very different as well. The things that we're struggling with right now will just become table stakes. everybody will be doing this. So it's constantly, a big activity for us on Firebase to be customer centric, to make sure we talk to developers. We have all these feedback channels to make sure that we continue to build things that are relevant. And from that angle, extensions is a great example of something that we saw the trends where people are really integrating. They want end-to-end solutions. How can we provide that in a way that allows you to scale? Because I think, people often ask me, like, what is the big differentiator of Firebase, especially when we talk about so many other alternatives that are available. I think the biggest, strength that we have is that we combine two things. We give you better together, which means that Firebase works really well across all the various products that it provides. So you can get a one-stop solution for authentication, for database, for being able to execute code, extensions being a part of this, or to be able to deploy, do A/B testing, do all the various things you might really want to do. But the other big part is we're built or integrated heavily on top of Google Cloud, which means that you not only get the ease of use that that people typically associate with Firebase, but you also get the depth of capabilities that you can get by having a dedicated provider that is nicely integrated with the overall Firebase experience. So while you can get a lot done in Firebase, and many developers are pretty happy never leaving that Firebase console or Firebase UI, but if you want to, for example, let's say, increase the capabilities of the hardware that's powering some of your backend services, you're just one click away from seeing the exact same view in Google Cloud's version of the world, and you have very deep access to being able to do really sophisticated things. So we kind of able to balance both those worlds, because for us, our real audience is really, you're building an app, you're experimenting, you're trying something out, you have a problem, and then now you're next day you're like on top of Hacker News, or you're like a top downloaded app on the iOS App Store or Android App Store. And so we want to make sure that across the entire journey, from being able to just kick the tires and learn and try something, this crazy complicated world of serverless, you're able to be successful. But when you do become want to do more, I guess, more scaled up activities, that Firebase is still the right choice for you, and we are right along for the ride. So you never have to feel like Firebase is only good for certain things, and now I need to upgrade to something different. Our hope is that by building on top of Google Cloud, by continuing to give this ease of use, we're able to attract both sets of the challenges that go into app development.
Makes sense. LogRocket doesn't use Firebase, but we do use Google Cloud, and we're familiar with all the bells and whistles.
Yeah.
Impressive stuff. Where do you see Firebase going in the next couple of years? Since you have such a good pulse on developer uh, relations, where do you see the winds blowing, so to speak?
I think the Firebase is in that sweet spot right now where we're really focused on mobile development and web development, and we're still very early days in both of those areas. So I see us continuing to make sure that developers building for these platforms are successful. But we also see that the kind of apps that people are building, the devices they're targeting, is also getting much more wide. Before you never would have thought about having applications running on your watch, or applications running on your smart thermostat, or your television's having a programmable API surface, and all these things. And in many ways, it's not a stretch, because a lot of them do run common standard web technologies or common client-side technologies that everyone's already familiar with. The days where you had to have a bespoke programming language for any one particular thing doesn't really exist in great detail for many of the situations we're in right now. So I think it's going to be continuing to just go where developers are. I think the next 2 or 3 years will be, we have some ideas, and you might have seen at like the Google I/O keynotes where we talked extensively about how we use artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how do we just simplify decision making where we don't need to have a human being always be involved. But ultimately for us though is, if developers are saying that they wish tasks A, B, and C were simpler, we will look at that very closely and see, do we deliver that directly, or do we find a more holistic solution that kind of gets to the root of why are developers having the problems A, B, and C. It goes back to the classic example that I've heard about. If you ask people what they want, they just want a faster car, but sometimes an airplane is what they really need. And so there's a little bit of an art and creativity to how we look at customer feedback and what developers are telling us, and how we decide to address them in a way that kind of gives you a nice, simple, delightful experience as well. I think that's often an understated fact, especially when we think about developer tools and developer platforms and framework.
Delightful. That's a good word. Yes. Um, Another thing that really stood out to me in the keynote was the deploy command. I don't really use Next.js or something like that. So just back in the day when all these sorts of things were so much harder. I really like that focus on.
Yeah, it's been one of those things where a lot of us who have been watching the trends and how people are building apps, it really almost came out overnight where you went from like static sites where you just generate static pages that, go through a complicated build process, but the output is just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, to a world where you're writing what seems like client-side JavaScript. You're in your VS Code editor, you're in whatever code editor of choice actually, and you're just writing things. And it so happens that some of the things you're writing lives on a server-side component. Others happen to live on just a static hosting backend. But as a developer, the frameworks have done such a wonderful job of abstracting away all the details. You don't worry about that anymore. You just care about, I want a good experience. I have all this data. I want to surface. Just make it work properly. Make the caching work properly. Make the deployments work properly. And so that really gave us the opportunity to kind of take the Firebase style of, okay, let's do some of the simplification and apply to this world as well. All this orchestration between all these services, let's go ahead and solve that. And continuing down the train of meeting developers where they are, we said, okay, a large number of developers are using Next.js, or they're using Angular, or they're using Nuxt. So let's just go after those markets at the very beginning and then see what the feedback is like and then go deeper. Our goal really is that whatever framework you're building on, long term, if it's relevant, Firebase is going to be playing a role right beside you, and making sure that deployment and all the various activities that go along with it are pretty seamless.
Yeah, impressive stuff. I can't wait to see how this goes in the future, especially as you said, everyone seems to be jumping on the or re-jumping on the server-side rendering bandwagon.
Yeah, it's like a pendulum. It always swings back and forth.
Yes.
There's a time when everyone's like, static site rendering is like the best way of doing things. It's all performant. Then it's like, okay, the client's doing a lot of work, and there's too much JavaScript on like low powered devices. Let's move everything to the server, and then it comes
Mhm.
back to like let's move everything back in the client. And
Yep.
it's always funny because the way I do all of my personal development is I still actually use a very traditional LAMP-based stack, where I'm just running like a Linux server and with like Apache and MySQL running behind it, and PHP, and I still FTP content from like my disk to wherever I need to serve it. And there were periods of time when people would just be going like, "Wait, this is so outdated. Why are you doing it this way?" There's a period of time like 10 years later where it's like, "Oh, this is exactly how you should be doing things. Minimize complications, simplify build steps." So I'm just waiting for the world when we get to see like the era of what you see, where you get editors like Dreamweaver and Front Page and so on to be back in style again. So I'm just like not going to change. I'm just going to let society and the world catch up to this workflow because it works, and I can totally see it happening again.
It's like a fashion trend. Just continue to wear, you know, bell bottoms, and then eventually they'll come in style again or something.
Yeah,
Um,
there you go. There you go.
that same topic has came up so many times on PodRocket with everyone. Like the trend of front end tools getting complex and then getting centralized and then decentralized, and like one tool does everything versus one tool that just does one thing, and you use many of those. It's came up.
Yeah, I think one trend that's actually really interesting in that particular vein is that the growth of like tools that do better performance analysis and monitoring and accessibility monitoring, I think that's going to be influencing a lot of how we end up building apps, because the amount of emphasis I see today, for example, on Chrome's Lighthouse scores and making sure you're having good scores across all those categories, because it's not just okay, great, I have really good scores. In many ways, it influences your ability to provide a good user experience, have better rankings in the search engines, for example, because there's a certain signal that all of these efforts are showing that as sites are more popular, as they are more performant, they tend to just perform better. So it's very likely that people want to visit them over another site that is not doing one of these directions. And so anything that kind of continues the train of making the technology behind the scenes just faster and more powerful, while still keeping the user focus in mind of how do you make things faster, more accessible, more secure? I think that creates the right incentive structure, because I think that was missing for a long time. I always felt like there were periods where there was cool technology for the sake of cool technology, but in the end, what we ended up with were websites that were like 10 megabytes of JavaScript to essentially provide a glorified version of Hello World, which you're just kind of going like, this isn't the web that we should be going towards. But hopefully, these kind of activities will incentivize the right behaviors.
It'll be a slow transition if I know anything about web development.
Yes, and by the time we're halfway through it, something new would have come out, and you have to decide like, do I
Yep.
continue on this path or do I just jump to the new thing?
And in 5 years, we'll have another Pod Rocket episode, and you'll come on and we'll say, "Oh, the next big thing is this." We were
Yeah,
fools to think it was something
exactly.
else.
Exactly. The thing I talked to you about 5 years ago, well, that's all great, but here's nothing else, something else you want to try because here's what the developer pain points are right now. It's what makes this area fun as well. And it's why I still enjoy this whole space of working on developer platforms and developer tools and frameworks. Is there's no shortage of exciting things to work on, and it's a good balance between like keeping your eye on what's relevant today and also what the future might look like, and hopefully even having a chance to be able to shape what the future is going to be like because you have the ability to kind of use the history of hindsight and then some of the data from today to chart a path that maybe the right thing or maybe not, but that's what makes it fun on Firebase, especially where we ship frequently. We iterate, we try things out, and we try to learn from that and see how we can do better next time around.
Well, thank you for coming on. It was good to have you. Um,
Likewise, it's great chatting with you. Great chatting about Firebase and just all the fun stuff that goes on in the world of developers.